Okay, the session is now being recorded. Welcome everyone to SOCSI 100 week 15.1. So as I've mentioned, our last 2 weeks, week 15 and week 16, will all be utilized for synchronous sessions. So we'll have synchronous sessions on Tuesdays and Thursdays, as opposed to our initial arrangement of the Tuesday being asynchronous and the Thursday being synchronous. So that way we could have a bit more time to talk about stuff that I think you will find interesting and helpful in so far as understanding our current situation is concerned. So for the sake of those who were not able to answer the poll, so I sent out a question. I sent out a poll asking people whether they would like to continue with the thematic historical trajectory of our lessons, or they would like to have this sort of special topics under social sciences. And it appeared that majority of the students opted for the second option. And I think it's good because it's also putting social science into practice. So it's not that we're abandoning technically our syllabus. It's not that we're doing something entirely different. It's that we're just moving forward a bit, no. And later on, I'll try to explain to you the connection between what we've been talking about thus far and the connection to this one. But in the later topics that we will be covering, for example, next week we're going to cover a critical theorist, no, philosopher, social scientist, psychoanalyst, Theodore Adorno. Not psychoanalyst really, but someone who dip his feet into the waters of psychoanalysis. Um, we're basically going to cover these kinds of things as part of the developing history of the social sciences, because the thematic historical part, or sorry, fashion of teaching the historical context of the social sciences is more or less focused, at least for me, about the conditions which allow or do not allow social scientific inquiry to take place, right? Um, so today we're going to talk about something very similar, something very connected, but it's no longer about inquiry, and it's about freedom. So let me begin by sharing with you my presentation, and then later on we will be shifting to the reading, because I'd like to provide some context for now. If you have any questions, by the way, please feel free to unmute yourself or just raise your hand. Or if you want to chat, please make sure that it's sent to everyone. So I've just enabled that once again, so that everyone can read your insights and your questions. Okay, so autonomy and political maturity, and then this is the theme I chose for this Tuesday. And you might be wondering, of all things that we could discuss, why autonomy, right? Why autonomy? Why political maturity? Um, well, Kant, Immanuel Kant is considered as one of the or not one, but perhaps the progenitor of the philosophical problematization of autonomy. And why is it that it is important? If you look at the etymology of autonomy, right? Autonomos, it means you're you are a self giving yourself a law, right? Autonomos. It's a self-giving law. What is the importance of that? In the period of ancient Greeks, there are cities which are autonomous, and there are cities which are heteronymous. What does that mean? So when I say that some cities are autonomous, it means that these are cities in ancient Greece that make their own laws. They are viewed in contrast to heteronymous cities, which, as opposed to making its own laws, has its mother city make its laws for them. So heteronymous cities are actually really colonies, no? And because they are colonies, they cannot allow they are not allowed to make their own laws. They have to submit themselves to the laws of their mother cities. So what's the connection of that to our current situation? After that political conception, or actually juridical conception of autonomy, it has become linked to moral philosophy, right? It has become linked with the idea of freedom, the idea of rights, especially. And if you want to understand our situation today, a lot of the confusing things that we've been experiencing emanates from this problem of freedom, right? So autonomy is inextricably linked with freedom, right? It's almost synonymous with freedom. But autonomy has a certain weight to it that is oftentimes, um, not underscored in freedom, and that is responsibility. So when I say that I can determine for myself the criteria by which I should act, the laws by which I should act, if I can determine that for myself, it means that I am autonomous. It means that I do not require the influence of others. I am not under the influence of others, which would restrict my capacity to determine for myself my own courses of action. Okay. So when someone is autonomous, okay, and let's put it this way, um, there are two concepts of freedom that would be very helpful, and this is from Isaiah Berlin's Two Concepts of Liberty. One is negative freedom, and the other one is positive freedom. When we say we have negative freedom, it means that we are free from, okay? We're free from obstructions that would hinder us as to what we can do, that would hinder us in our capacity to do what we want to do what we can do, right? Uh, what is an example of that? No, a common example of that would be poverty, right? If you want to live a certain way of life, for example, a luxurious life, if you are bound by poverty, you are not free to do as you wish. So in order for you to be able to think even the possibility of living a luxurious life, you have to be free from poverty. Right? Another example would be restrictions on the freedom of speech. Right? You can only say that you are in a truly free environment when your speech is not restricted, when you are not being censored for what you say. No, so in order for you to have that environment, you must be free from restriction. So it's freedom from. Positive freedom, on the other hand, is freedom to. Okay, freedom to do as you wish, freedom to determine, what you think is the best possible course of action. So those two go hand in hand. Sometimes, in order for you to realize your freedom to, or most of the times rather, in order for you to understand what you are free to do, you have to have an understanding of what are the certain aspects, conditions, or factors that may otherwise prevent you from doing what you want to do, right? And so again, what is the connection of this to our current situation? Well, I suppose you've seen a lot of people invoking their freedom when they are being, for instance, forced to wear masks in public places. I'm not sure, what the situation is already in the Philippines, but for example, in United States, a lot of groups, a lot of the groups of people feel threatened when they are being tried. Sorry, when they're being convinced by the government to keep wearing their masks, and so some people would think that it's a form of restriction on the part of their freedom. Some people think that if you are recommending vaccines to them, it is sort of a restriction on their freedom. And that's the sort of the international context, right? In this story of the pandemic, the unfolding pandemic, and in our own local context, again, I'm sure you've seen some people justify their vote, or in the context of the recent national elections, they tend to justify their vote by saying that I'm free to vote, right? I've seen people argue about that in social media alone. You can see a lot of like examples, and I saw this like uh, there's a there's a supporter for one candidate trying to talk to another supporter of a different candidate, and they couldn't, they couldn't reach a middle ground. And then the reason for that, I think, is because the other candidate doesn't really want to give reasons for their exercise of their freedom to choose. And then the common theme is that I also have the right to choose, and you cannot question my right and my freedom to choose whoever I think is best for the position. But then comes the problematic part, because what does it mean to be really free? What does it mean to have those rights, right? For those of you who are fellow minors here, you might have heard of social contract theory, right? I'm not sure if anyone has heard about that, but so the premise of social contract theory is that, for example, in Thomas Hobbes, if all of us were to exercise our absolute unlimited freedom, we'll probably just end up killing each other. He says we are going to end up in what he calls a bellum omnium contra omnes, the war of all against all, because we're self-serving individuals. That's the position of Hobbes. And he said, in order for us to live well together in a society, we must surrender a portion of our freedom to a sovereign. That is the Leviathan. So the social contract is basically surrendering a portion of your freedom so that there would be order. So right then and there, there's already an allowable restriction to freedom. But what is the, you know, how does it relate to our current situation? What does it mean to say that, I also have my right and freedom to choose? If I have my right and freedom to choose, for example, not to wear a mask, not to get vaccinated, not to believe in experts, not to believe in the science, if I have my right and freedom not to believe in accurate history, if I invoke my right and freedom not to to choose a certain candidate based on what I think is right, if I have that kind of freedom, does it excuse me from being responsible for it? Right? Does it excuse me from being responsible for my actions? For those of you who ride the motorcycle, for those of you who drive a car, kung marunong kayo magmaneho, that kind of road safety uh, um, dynamic is important to understanding freedom, right? Of course, technically, we have the freedom to speed up, no? But are we being responsible when we're using that kind of freedom, or must we understand the reasons why there are traffic laws in place? Um, so it's a kind of freedom that is very problematic, because when I say that we have a problem with freedom, I think there are two ways to understand that problem. So first is the understanding of the concept itself, which is a problem. And the second is the problems that arise whenever a particular understanding of the concept of freedom is being invoked, is being used, is being advanced. So Kant has a very interesting, lengthy discussion on that. And I regret I won't be able to cover much, but for Kant, autonomy is in itself a moral concept, right? You cannot just claim autonomy, you cannot just invoke freedom and not link it with moral responsibility. There's a reason for that. So for those of you who have had maybe ethics and have had the opportunity to talk about Immanuel Kant, this is why um, anything that we think we should do has to be subjected to the principle of universalization. right? Is this something? Is this maxim that I want to do? Can this become a universal law? If I want to lie because I want to get out of paying my debts, for instance, okay, I could do that. But what if that becomes a universal law? Okay, what if everyone just lied whenever it is convenient for them to lie? Then it wouldn't make sense according to Kant, because then you will have no concept of truth. There would be no point of talking to each other because you wouldn't know what whether they were telling the truth or not. Uh, so there's a whole discussion of that, especially in his work, The Critique of Practical Reason. But for this particular text, we would be focusing. So our emphasis would be in freedom from, right? If you recall my distinction earlier, freedom from, negative freedom, and the critique of practical judgment, which is the moral philosophy of Kant, talks about freedom too. What are we free to do? But for this particular session, we're going to talk about negative freedom. Okay, and why is that important for our context? Well, when people say we are free, I'm free to choose whoever I want. I have the right to choose whoever I want. The question is how free really we are, right? I don't know if you've thought about those kinds of things. And if you link this with, contemporary sociologists, Nicole Corato, Jonathan Ong, are doing these kinds of studies on the systems of network disinformation, the architecture of network disinformation, right? Uh, how do you understand, like, how do we know whether we are really free, right? Um, if you're familiar with like advertisements or commercials, right? Merong famous toothpaste that would say that 9 out of 10, sorry, dentists would recommend this toothpaste. Okay. But if you think about it, is it not a way of convincing you to listen or to understand the legitimacy of the product? So in that case, how free are we really when we say we're free to choose, the candidates we want to choose? After all, there is such a thing as a campaign. So in a way, we're not really free from any influence. We're being influenced towards a certain decision, right? So it will be interesting to problematize freedom in this way. And the reason why I chose this is because, apart from being the progenitor of the philosophical problematization of autonomy, I think Kant, is also an important figure for what would later on emerge, especially in the period of Marx, as a critique of ideology. Okay, and what is ideology? That's an altogether different session, but it's something that constitutes a part of our reality. And well, if you look at psychoanalysis, Jacques Lacan would say that truth has a structure of a fiction. So the complexity of our time today is actually not between true and false. And that's sort of the reason, if many of you, for instance, again, I don't know your political orientation, so I'm just observing what I see in my own circles, people I know. A lot of Robredo supporters keep on emphasizing that there is the truth. There is why can some people see it? These are credentials. These are matters of fact, and why can people see it? And I think it's because we still have, and the reason for that frustration is because we still have a binary understanding of reality as between true and false. But it's never simple, right? It's not a simple exam such as a true and false, wherein there are only two answers. What we have to understand is that false can itself present as a truth. And so when Lacan says that truth has a structure of a fiction, what we have to understand in that psychoanalytic perspective is that fiction itself can constitute a part of reality, and without that fiction, reality would that version of reality would crumble, right? Um, Imagine, for instance, how when we were all kids, we all believed in Santa Claus. Right? That's part of our reality, and it's not as if we were kids back then and saying, okay, I know it's true that there is no Santa Claus, but I would very much like to believe that there is a Santa Claus. It's not the case. For our reality back then, Santa Claus was real. So the fiction constitutes a significant part of reality. And if you say you are free to decide, you're free to think, you are free to choose whomever candidate you want to choose. The question is, and again, I hope you're seeing the connection here. The question is, how free are we really are, right? How free we really are in terms of being able to decide for ourselves, right? So that was a bit of an introduction for the introduction. Do you have any questions so far? Maybe insights or thoughts? I might be talking too much. If you have, feel free to interrupt me. Otherwise, I'll move forward. Or anything parallel analysis that you would like to share with us? Wala pa? Okay, sige, let's move forward. So, I want to talk about autonomy and political maturity, and the main text that we will be drawing on is a 1784 newspaper essay from Immanuel Kant, and the title is Beantwortung der Frage, was ist Aufklärung, which means an answer to the question, what is enlightenment? So a certain Reverend Zerlner raised this question and solicited answers. That's how they filled their newspapers back then. Oh, I want certain answers to this particular type of question. So saying, yeah, what is enlightenment? Give me your submissions, and a lot of people submitted their entries. I think this ran from 1784 to 1786, if I'm not mistaken. And the newspaper Berliner Monatschaft, Berlin Monthly, um, was able to gather a huge collection of writings, and Kant was the second essay in this series, if I'm not mistaken. So why this one? So who is Kant? For those of you who do not know Immanuel Kant, Kant was an 18th century philosopher who lived from 1724 to 1804. And he was born in Königsberg, which is now a city in Russia. And if you're wondering why he's a German philosopher but residing in Russia, that is because at a certain point, Russia was part of the Prussian Empire. Okay, so he was born in Königsberg, which is a Prussian city that is now in Kaliningrad. And the famous, of course, anecdote about his life is that, of course, he never left the city and he has a clockwork routine and so on. I can't talk about all of his contributions, but the thing that I could say, to put it very simply, is that he had a wide ranging influence that span for that continues to span, even that continues to expand even until today. No? So in terms of like his direct inheritors, for lack of a better term, that's why we have what we call post-Kantian German idealism, and it's pioneered by the likes of Johann Gottlieb Fichte, Friedrich Wilhelm Joseph von Schelling, and Georg Wilhelm Friedrich Hegel. And they were all influenced primarily by Kant's metaphysics, Kant's understanding of reality. But that is not to say that they weren't also influenced by Kant's aesthetics or theory of art, by Kant's moral and political philosophy. Contemporary philosophers, 20th and 21st century, from the 20th and 21st century, such as Jürgen Habermas, who is still alive, Jean Rawls, are all they're both influenced by Kant's political philosophy, right? Kant, Habermas is, I don't know how familiar are you with Habermas, but it's to put it very simply again, the reason why Habermas believes in a shared space of reason is because that is influenced by Kant's understanding of communities. Okay. In insofar as moral philosophy is concerned, a while ago we were talking about freedom and responsibility. This is advanced by contemporary female philosophers like Honora O'Neill and Christine Korsgaard. Okay. Kant had three main works, three main books. The first one is what we call Kritik der reinen Vernunft, which is the critique of pure reason. And the first edition was published in 1781. The second edition published in 1787. That's why when you open the Critique of Pure Reason, I'm not sure if any one of you would like to do that. You'll find A and B as its original paginations, because in the original German compilation, both the first and second editions are compiled. And then after that, Kant wrote the Kritik der praktischen Vernunft, which is the critique of practical reason, in 1788. And then the Kritik der Urteilskraft, or the critique of judgment, in 1790. So here's the context. And after this context, we'll talk about the text itself. Kant wrote his works against the backdrop of the Age of Enlightenment, which he found to be in a state of crisis. And again, I've mentioned a while ago that we're moving forward a bit because, well, we haven't really talked about, the entire period of modernity, right? I've already introduced to you Copernicus, and then of course you know that there was a certain revolution that happened in modernity, and Copernicus, of course, paved the way for Galileo, and Galileo paved the way for Newton. There are many figures in between. Before Newton, there was Descartes, insofar as mechanical philosophy is concerned. But it was a flourishing period for physics. But when I say flourishing, what we have to understand is it doesn't mean that it was met without resistance. Ang daming nangyari in between. Galileo had to abjure his own beliefs because he was summoned to the Inquisition. The church was still very powerful even in the age of Renaissance. The church was powerful. You have witch hunts, you have inquisitions, and it was an attempt to maintain control. But regardless, people such as Galileo and later on, very later on, Newton, were able to revolutionize physics. So the Enlightenment, the Age of Enlightenment, emerged from the rise and success of modern science in the 1500s and 1600s. Remember, Copernicus wrote in the 1500s, and so did Galileo, right? But later on, by the time of Newton, the spectacular achievements of Newton I'm quoting from an account on Kant in SEP, because it gives us a very good summary. So the spectacular achievements of Newton in particular engendered widespread confidence and optimism about the power of human reason to control nature and improve human life. But what is it with the claims of Newton that allowed for this to happen? So Newton developed what he calls mechanical philosophy, right? Which means that every movement that we can witness, every movement that we can understand, is governed by certain laws. And that's why you have the Newtonian laws of physics, or the laws of gravitation, for instance, or even the laws of movement, right? If you remember your elementary or maybe high school science, you would be familiar with what Newton is talking about. Every object, any object that remains at rest, that is at rest, will remain at rest unless a force acts on it. That's a universal law. So for Newton, anything that the reason why, for example, I can move this bottle of water is because I am a force that acted on an object of rest. Okay. So if you like have a basic understanding of that, right? It was in a way a move against the church, okay? Because from here on out, we begin to understand that, as a matter of fact, it's not divine providence that guides our action, it's the laws of nature. Okay, so very similar again from the shift from ancient Greek mythology to natural philosophy. So because of the mechanics of Newton, because of the physics of Newton, there emerged a very hopeful age of enlightenment. And the age of enlightenment believe in the power of human reason to control nature and improve human life. Okay? So one effect of this new confidence in reason was that traditional authorities such as the church and the state eventually were increasingly questioned. Okay, and we all know that the church is an authority figure, starting from the medieval ages, right? Why should we need political or religious authorities to tell us how to live or what to believe if each of us has the capacity to figure these things out for ourselves? This is the challenge of enlightenment. Para saan yung church? Para saan yung estado? Para saan yung state? Right? That's why, well, the Enlightenment also led to, things like the French Revolution, uh, because it believed in the capacity of people, you know, not to be chained to authorities, right? And that's especially with regard to the church, right? Again, just to bring it to our context, in the Philippines, there's always talk about the separation of church and state. And one of the things that became a problem for us, well, not really a new problem, was that the religious endorsements of political candidates, right? Is it really fair that some members of the clergy have their own positions, have their own political positions? Is it good to have positions, or should we extend it to endorsements? Because having a position and making an explicit endorsement are two very different things. But then again, you know, maybe having a position is an implicit endorsement. Okay. And what does the separation of church and state mean? But why is it always being invoked? Do we really understand what it means insofar as it is invoked in the Constitution? Right. Um, so we are not yet, surprisingly, in a very good position to be able to question the role of religion in our politics. I think the discussions about the role of religion in our politics only comes around whenever there are elections. But after that, issues seem to die down. So why am I saying this? I think because the discourse about it needs to continue. Because to a great extent, religious authorities influence the way we think. You cannot say you had the freedom or right to choose if you chose because of the endorsement of, you know certain political or religious authorities. So it raises the question of, up to what extent are we really free, right? So again, why should we need political or religious authorities to tell us how to live or what to believe if each of us has the capacity to figure these things out for ourselves? And this is the sort of enlightenment rebellion. Para saan yung estado? Para saan yung empire? Para saan yung simbahan kung kaya ko i-figure out on my own, for myself, what I need to do, what I need to believe? Okay? In the essay What is Enlightenment, Kant thinks that enlightenment can certainly lead us towards progress. But as we will see in the text later on, the only question is whether we are actually correct to say that what is called the age of enlightenment is in fact an enlightened age. Because for Kant, these are two very different things. Okay. For some, it was quite difficult to assume that just because all of us thought for ourselves, that just because all of us had the full sovereignty of human reason over traditional authorities such as church and state, human progress would follow suit. It was quite a problematic argument for some thinkers na hindi porket reason na natin yung sinusunod natin magkakaroon na ng progress. Because that's the assumption of enlightenment. Okay? And why is that problematic? And this is where Kant comes in, because he thought, okay, papalitan natin yung church na, as the traditional authority, and papalitan natin ng what? It merely gets replaced by human reason. So what's the difference? We are still sort of like enslaved by an authority. Okay. So would this be bad? Would it lead to a decline in morality and religiosity? What if the replacement of the traditional authority of the church with the authority of human reason would lead to materialism, to fatalism, to atheism, to skepticism, or even libertinism and authoritarianism? What if it leads to those things? So the original, as I was mentioning a while ago, the original inspiration for the period of enlightenment was the success of modern science. Again, through Copernicus, Galileo, and most importantly, later on through Newton. The emphasis above all else was Newtonian or mechanistic physics. This simply means that we can understand the mechanisms that make everything move, even our lives. So the entire realm of nature is like, for Newton, a machine. We can understand how it works. Okay? Everything in nature is reducible to certain laws that can be understood. So once you understand the laws of nature, you would understand how things work, right? Again, if I give you an example, for example, I have a pen here. Because I have an understanding of the law of gravitation, I know that when I let this go, let this pen go off of my fingers, then it would fall. Okay, then it would fall. I know the same thing will happen to my mouse if I drop it. So because of that, there is a certain kind of physical determinism. We know what will happen because there are laws of nature. Okay, but herein lies the problem, because, well, we're human beings, and technically we are part of nature. It's not the case that we're external to nature. We are part of nature. So if for Newton, nature is entirely governed by mechanistic or causal laws, then it seems that there's no room for freedom. Kasi sa umpisa pa lang, determined na pala kung anong mangyayari because we are part of nature. Do you follow the line of criticism? Um, Newton argues that nature is understandable by certain laws. Okay. But the problem is that we are part of nature. So does that mean that we are subject to the same deterministic laws? Because if we are, then how then do we make sense of human freedom? So effectively, this threatened the traditional view that morality requires freedom. Okay, I was telling you a while ago that in order for you to be able to do what you want to do, in order for you to be free to do what you want to do, you have to have that freedom. Otherwise, you can't do anything. We must be free in order to choose what is right and over what is wrong, because otherwise we cannot be held responsible. What do I mean by that? If you are forced, if you are coerced to do something, you are not really responsible for it. Diba? Kaya nga merong mga, for those of you who are familiar with the penal code or certain laws in the Philippines, like there are mitigating circumstances to certain actions, because if you are not, directly responsible for certain actions, then it's unfair as well to put the entire blame on you. No, halimbawa, just to give you a very simplistic example, halimbawa, nasa library ka, and then in a library you're supposed to be quiet, right? And but someone eventually puts a knife, like tries to tinututukan ka ng kutsilyo, and sinasabi sa'yo na sumigaw ka. Pag hindi ka sumigaw, itutusok ko yung kutsilyo sa'yo, right? Then if you shout and the librarian gets mad at you, or catches you, you're not really responsible for that because you have been coerced to do that. Okay. Oh yes, Leo, that's right. Parang sa insanity plea. It has something to do, that's correct, with accountability, right? Because you're not in your right senses, and you're not completely responsible for what you are doing, right? Or again, the other context is that you're being threatened kapag hindi mo binoto itong kandidato na to, alam mo na mangyayari sa pamilya mo. Then when that happens, right, you're being coerced to do something and you're not really free from it, in order to be free to do what you would otherwise think should be done. Okay? So if there's a determinism of that sort, then morality is impossible. Okay? If we are governed, again, in the Kantian argument contra Newton, if we are governed by the laws of nature, morality would not be possible because there would be no freedom, right? We're already determined in what we want to do. So that's sort of what Kant is trying to address. Okay. I'm trying to put it in a very simple, like simplistic, reductive way, because it would take maybe a couple of sessions to be able to introduce you the entire project of Kant. Okay. Uh, so to continue, modern science, the pride of enlightenment, the source of its optimism about the powers of human reason, threatened to undermine traditional moral and religious beliefs that free rational thought was expected to support. Okay, and for Kant, that was the uh, uh, main intellectual crisis of the Enlightenment. Okay, because Enlightenment believed so much in reason, believed so much in Newtonian mechanics, but the problem is that it cannot be reconciled with morality, because in order for you to have morality, you have to have freedom. So Kant's three critiques, the one I showed you before, are an attempt to respond to that, and it's a very, very, very complicated response. And to put it very simply, again, before we can know what we can do and what we cannot do, and this will be the subject of the critique of practical reason, Kant will first attempt to answer what can we know, and this he will do in the critique of pure reason, because in that particular work he will show that determinism cannot be known to be true, and thus freedom is possible. So he will dispute the Newtonian mechanics, and that, that sort of problem, how do you reconcile freedom and nature? Because we cannot, Kant would not argue that, okay, we are free, so that means we're external to nature. Kant is not going to argue that way. The reconciliation between freedom and nature is something that would inspire, the post-Kantian German idealist Fichte, Hegel, Schelling to problematize that freedom and nature. So Kant would show that determinism cannot be true in the critique of pure reason, and thus that freedom is possible. And then once he transitions to the critique of practical reason, he will argue that the reality of human freedom is established by our experience of moral obligation, which is imperative. Like this is what he calls the categorical imperative. Human freedom, we have freedom because we have a sense of obligation. All right. So again, it's a very nuanced conception of freedom, and I'm not saying you should agree with it. I'm saying that this is something that we have to consider. So apparently, freedom cannot be freedom without responsibility, without obligation. But then, if you extend this research, right, this line of thinking, it's going to have some problems, because there are some people who do not share your paradigm of rationality, right? And for me, this is the reason why attempts of, for example, again, Robredo supporters to convince Marcos supporters or other supporters of other candidates, I think that it's the reason why these attempts did not work as well as they wanted it to work, because you have different paradigms of reason. To a Robredo supporter, it's all well and good that they are, they know about meritocratic ways, meritocracy, credentialism, and so on. But to some of these other supporters, it's not the language of reason that they speak. Kant is here coming from the premise of shared experience of moral obligation. That's something common to us. But that was the 18th century. A lot has changed. And this is where, neo-Kantians and other critical theorists would debate with each other that whether Kant's theory still works or not. Because the moment you force other people to speak your language, right, you're effectively creating a sort of a hostile environment. That's why a lot of, there are debates that are taking place in either camps. I'm sure you've observed something similar. You always see that there's this feeling that someone or some people are being cornered, right? And that is because, again, they have a different conception of what it means to exercise their own freedom. So the moment you make people accountable, right, and this is where freedom, responsibility, accountability all fall together. The moment you make freedom accountable, the moment you make other people feel accountable for their own exercise of freedom, you subject them to an imposed standard, to an imposed language, which, for all intents and purposes, could appear as a hostile, as a dangerous, as an uncomfortable environment for them. Okay, I hope you get where I'm getting at. Let me provide you with a simple example. Uh, in order, for instance, in the traditional classroom setting, in order for an absence to be excused, right, there needs to be a valid reason. So what does having a valid reason mean? That means that not all reasons are valid. Now, for example, you have an 7 a.m. class and you have a quiz for that day. But the problem is that either na-traffic ka, so na-late ka, or na-late ka ng gising, kaya na-late ka ng pag-alis ng bahay. So you were not able to take the exam. But if you tell your teacher the truth, na-traffic po ako o na-late po ako ng gising, which you could not have controlled, right? You were up all night studying. So na-late ka ng gising, malayo yung tinitirahan mo. I'm sure if you say na traffic ka or na late ka ng gising, those things will not be considered a valid reason. So you need to come up with something valid in order for you to be able to take the exam. Do you get what I'm saying? So the school has its own criteria for accountability, for responsibility. That anything that doesn't fall within it is not considered a valid reason. Okay. So this is where it gets problematic in the context of our times. How do we do that if we have different conceptions of rationality? Diba? Kaya nga yung one of the best books I think from this Scottish philosopher Alasdair MacIntyre is titled Whose Reason, Which Rationality? Right? If you say that morality has to be rational, or autonomy or the exercise of freedom has to be rational, you have to ask that challenge: whose reason, which rationality are we talking about? Because otherwise we cannot, I think, presuppose that there is just one universal rationality that governs all of us. We have different reasons. Diba? Katulad nga ng mga nakikita nating mga social media engagement, social media debates. There's a reason why it doesn't work, because parang dalawang batong nag-uumpugan yun eh. They cannot get through each other. Okay? So, this is the sort of the problem that Kant Kant develops in his moral philosophy. But as I've said, we're going to do the another track, which is negative freedom. And that is freedom from certain control, freedom from certain obstructions. So I'm going to share with you the text. Oh, before that, do you have any questions or insights for now? Any thoughts? Is everything clear so far? Questions, comments, insights, anything? How about the others? Janina, Nicole, Andrew, Petrin, Elisa, Joy, Leo, Mia, Rumi, Jasmine. Okay, so right, I suppose everything is clear so far. I hope it is. And then let's talk about the reading. So I'm not sure if you've had the opportunity to browse through the text, but in any case, I'll be presenting the text here. So the text that I wanted us to cover is this one. As I've mentioned, it's an answer to the question, what is enlightenment? Right? It's a 1784 essay from Immanuel Kant. This is a short text. And the first paragraph of the text is actually the most quoted, probably the most quoted passage from Kant, right? And Kant is talking about his ideal conception of enlightenment here. So according to Kant, I hope you can see it, enlightenment is man's emergence from his self-incurred immaturity. Immaturity is the inability to use one's own understanding without the guidance of another. The immaturity is self-incurred if its cause is not lack of understanding, but lack of resolution and courage to use it without the guidance of another. The motto of enlightenment is therefore sapere aude, or dare to be wise. Have the courage to use your own understanding. And the emphasis is own. This is basically an account of autonomy, enlightenment account of autonomy. So let's pick this passage apart, right? Emergence, what does emergence mean? In other translations, some people would suggest that the term should be release, the term should be exit. But if you think about the constellation of those terms, emergence, release, exit, you're kind of thinking about negative freedom, right? You want to be free from a certain condition. And what is this condition? This condition is this self-incurred immaturity. Not just immaturity, but the problem, according to Kant, is self-incurred immaturity. Now, let's talk about immaturity first. When you talk about immaturity, Kant uses the term Unmündigkeit, right? Unmündigkeit. And in the context of the English language, immaturity has a very simplistic, reductive meaning. in our English language, when we talk about immature people, we talk about childish people, we talk about people who laugh or make jokes all the time, and can't get serious when it needs to be serious. So that's our version of immaturity. But Kant has a very advanced conception of immaturity, of unmundigkeit. Okay, and he labels this as the inability to use one's own understanding without the guidance of another. What does that remind you of again? That reminds you of the issue about negative freedom. Okay, we require negative freedom when we are bound by certain control, bound by certain influences that prevents us to exercise our own freedom. Okay, to do what we want to do as we see fit. So we have immaturity when we have the inability to use our own understanding without the guidance of another. Okay, I suppose that's quite clear, right? That you do not rely on your own capacity to think, but you rely on other people. And you might say, well, it's simple. Kant is talking here, talking about, sheep, mga sunod lang ng sunod. And to some extent, yes, that's true. But it also can get more complicated, as I've mentioned to you, and this will be the point of departure of Theodor Adorno when we talk about him next Thursday. Um, there are certain influences that are so subtle that you don't think it actually controls you, right? That's why Adorno has this idea of the culture industry as a form of control. Because, for example, if you're scrolling through your phone, you keep on seeing ads, and all of a sudden you say, okay, sige nga, mag-iipon ako para sa mid-year sale ng Shopee o mid-year sale ng Lazada or whatever, no? And you see these things that you think it inspires you to buy stuff, but it actually nudges you. It controls you to think in a certain way. Moving beyond Kant here, I'm going to move beyond Kant for a while. There's a reason why if you go to malls, right? Kung familiar kayo sa struktura or arkitektura ng mga mall, there's a reason why escalators are usually at the other, at the extreme ends of the buildings. And the reason for that is because they want you, or the people who design malls want you to go through every store before you go up. And because that would increase the chances of you seeing a product that you might want to buy. Okay. It's the same reason why drinks are free in casinos. 'Di ba? In yung mga lugar kung saan pwedeng magsugal, maggamble, drinks are free there. And the reason for that is because, well, the more drunk you get, the more chances of you raising the stakes in the games you play. So these are subtle forms of control, di ba? And again, in the context of our national elections, kung nagre-release na ng results kahit wala pang official counting, and showing that one candidate is already leading the other, or leading the race, leading the poll, it creates a certain uh, conditioning, no, to our way of thinking. Yeah, Andrew is, yes. Oh, basically Andrew is saying mind conditioning, right? It creates a certain way of making you think the way that the way that the way that they want you to think. And if you think about it, right, there's nothing wrong with that, in the sense that I'm not saying there's nothing morally wrong with that. I'm saying that there's nothing legally wrong with that, because, well, there's no law saying that you can't campaign, that you can't advance for the positions of your party, if your candidate. Ito yung sinasabi ko kaninang fiction is inscribed in reality. The truth has a structure of a fiction. Or if you want to move away to psychoanalytic, if you want to move from psychoanalysis towards philosophy, this is where it gets interesting, because you have concepts and you have the distortions of these concepts. You have elections and you have the concept of cheating. And in the aftermath of the elections, many are rallying for this idea that, oh no, nadaya, and so on and so on. But even now, right, the PPRCV or something, saying that there's no problems with the count and so on. And that may be true, right? It might really be the case that a majority of the Filipinos voted for Bongbong Marcos. Okay, so Andrew is sharing here, even in the news, we call it framing sa communication. Yes. So it's good that you have that you brought this similar concept up, right? Um, would you like to share a bit more about it? Uh, this concept of framing, Andrew?
Hi, sir. So basically, journalism classes we're taught to see parang may angles kasi when we're viewing news. So as much as possible, we remain quote unquote objective. So basically getting all sides. But the tendency is nowadays we have the tendency to see news that are quite biased. We're only looking at one side. So I think that's one problem that we face today within the scope of disinformation and biased news. Ayun po.
Yeah, thank you for that. Yeah, that is very interesting. I don't know if you've seen, if you've seen the series called The Newsroom. I don't know kung napanood mo na yan, but like it portrays this ideal utopian kind of news agency that is profoundly objective. But then, it got criticized by media personnel themselves, because they're saying that at the heat of the moment, when you need to report something, sometimes you just have to choose a side. And so they make it as though objectivity is difficult in terms of the media profession. And of course, objectivity is in itself philosophically a problematic concept, no? It doesn't mean that it's devoid of like our subjective attachments to it. um Halimbawa, pag sinabi nating objective exam, meron kang hinahanap na sagot, kahit naman ano yung isagot mo dun, ikaw pa rin yung sumasagot. So your subjectivity is never really detached from that objectivity. So going back to that was very great, Andrew. Thank you for that. Going back to what I was saying, in philosophy, we have we have concepts and we have distortions of that concept. So you have elections and then cheating, and we think these are binary opposites, right? To a great extent, they are. But these are not separate opposites. These are opposites that that co-constitute each other. So they are co-constitutive of each other. So again, you pass from, there's this transition from a notion and its distortion, elections and cheating, to a notion. Sorry, it passes from a notion and its distortion, election and cheating, to the distortion of that notion constitutive of that notion, right? Cheating inscribed in the very system itself. And how does that work? Through, again, mind conditioning. If yun nga yung dito yung maganda yung research nila Nicole Curato and then ni Jonathan Ong. You can listen to it in podcasts. If you don't have the time to read, you can listen. It's in Spotify, it's in Anchor FM, it's in YouTube. You can find them everywhere. Try to listen. It's some very short stuff, and it will make you understand why there's like they circumvented the legality of it all, because there's nothing wrong with hiring PR companies to promote your stuff. But the moment you use that strategy, right, like you already try to remove freedom from the people to be able to choose what they want, because you control the narrative, which is the same thing that Britain did for Brexit, right? the first referendum, they targeted specific people to be, to be shown certain kinds of ads in order for them to be nudged towards certain kinds of positions. So we did go away from just to give you another example before I forget. um the most important example of that is uh Pierre there's this philosopher named Pierre Joseph Proudhon who said that property is theft. And if you hear that, you might be wondering, what is he talking about? He's stupid. Those are two different things. But what he's effectively saying is that the concept of theft is already inscribed in property, because you cannot think of theft without property. Every theft occurs because there is property. And before we misunderstand things, it's not a moral justification of property. It's an ontological justification of property, of theft, of the co-constitutiveness of both. No, it's not a moral justification. It's not saying, okay, so ganun pala, so we should just keep on stealing. No, it says that the reason why we have an understanding of the concept of theft is because we have an understanding of the concept of property. In the same way that you cannot think of dogmatism without religion. You cannot think of fanaticism without religion. Okay. It's inscribed in it. So again, from a distortion of a notion to a distortion constitutive of that notion, right? So it's inscribed in reality itself. So if we go back to Kant, Kant is not talking about that kind of thing, but it originates from that sort of discussion that Kant introduces, which is immaturity, right? And that's why I was very interested to read Kant as one of the first critics of ideology. Okay. So Kant defines immaturity as the inability to use our own understanding. And in what ways could that happen? For Kant, there are very explicit ways about how our inability to use our own understanding can happen. But as I was telling you, as we move forward in our history, there are more sinister and implicit ways that that could happen. And that the problem is that we don't know about it. As this Slovenian contemporary philosopher would love to say, Slavoj Žižek, sabi niya, the reason why we feel free because we lack the language to articulate our unfreedom. And everything is fine for us. Oh. He uses this. He has this particular joke about communists migrating to Serbia and so on. And so you have, for the sake of simple narrative, let's say person X and person Y, and person Y is going to a communist country and said to person X, I will write to you. I will write a report to you about what the state of the country is. Everything that I will write in blue ink is true. Everything that I would write in red ink is false, so that they can circumvent the censorship, state censorship. Sabi ni person Y, nung sumulat na siya sa kanyang kaibigan, sabi niya, he wrote in blue ink. No? Everything in this country is so progressive. They show Western cinema. They tolerate different types of religion. They are progressive towards gender and so on and so on and so on. All of those progressive, liberal things. But using the very blue ink, he said, remember, the blue ink is for truth. Everything is complete here. The only thing that they're missing is the red ink. Okay? I don't know if you get the joke. So the only thing that's missing is the red ink, which implies he meant to use the red ink to write all of those stuff, which meant that it's actually false, that the state of the country is not really like that. So that's a reason why we feel free, because we lack that red ink. We think everything is good because we lack the language to articulate our unfreedom. And that's the more sinister ways about how immaturity takes place in our situation today. Okay. So Kant is very explicit about the causes of immaturity. So at certain points, he's also very stubborn. He's saying this immaturity, and I'm still in the first paragraph, is self-incurred. So, if its cause is not lack of understanding, but lack of resolution and courage to use it without the guidance of another. As if we are explicit and, okay, gusto kong magpaalipin sa media. Okay, gusto kong magpaalipin sa fake news. Sige, kontrolin na ako ng narrative ng fake news. But it's not as simple as that in our time today. Maybe it was in Kant. That's why he was very explicit about it. No? So he was saying immaturity, self-incurred immaturity results from a lack of resolution and courage to use our own understanding. As if we know, and this is I show this because I want you to know how problematic is this to apply in our own particular situation. Right? It's not the case that, for example, if again, I don't know your political stance, but it's not the case that Marcos supporters are just, okay, sige, magpapaniwala tayo sa fake news. No? Di bale nang maniwala tayo sa fake news. It's not that. It's not, their immaturity is not as simple as that. Right? Hindi lang yun dahil wala silang resolution and courage to use their own understanding, as if when they use their own understanding, it would be the same reason as the Robredo supporters, the same rationality. Right? But in any case, this is the more explicit version of Kant. He says here, laziness and cowardice are the reasons why such a large proportion of men, even when nature has long emancipated them from alien guidance, nevertheless gladly remain immature for life. For the same reasons, it is all too easy for others to set themselves up as their guardians. So because people conveniently want to remain in that state of immaturity, they would be more than happy if other people were to dictate what they should believe, what they should think, and so on. So, according to Kant, it is so convenient to be immature. If I have a book to have understanding in place of me, a spiritual advisor to have a conscience for me, a doctor to judge my diet for me, and so on, I need not make any efforts at all. I need not think. So long as I can pay, others will soon enough take the tiresome job take the tiresome job over for me. So what does this tell us? What is the implicit message of Kant here? To use your own reason requires a certain amount of labor, because you have to think about the consequences of your action. You have to think about the accountability. You have to think of responsibility. But if you're just subservient to other forms of rationalities, right? If you're subservient to authorities, to guardians, then you need not worry yourself. You need not be bothered by those kinds of baggage. Okay? Meron namang libro na magsasabi sa iyo kung ano ang dapat mong malaman. In the same way na meron naman tayo ngayong sources in our contemporary network of disinformation. We have TikTok, we have YouTube, we have conspiracy theories, videos, Facebook posts, social media threads, and so on. A lot of things. If that does the understanding for some people, well, they don't need to exercise their own understanding. It's enough for them. Okay? Kaya nga later on, for Theodore Adorno, who is sort of using this as a point of departure, for him, the role of education is to develop an attitude for contradiction. Okay? Okay, yan ang sabi nito. How can I disprove that? How can I think differently from that? Okay? But again, I'm not saying that it is as simple as this in our situation. I'm saying that there are parallels in it, but it's not directly similar. But we have to see this in this light. Right? Kasi, again, bringing in a Marxist materialist perspective, we have to also look at the material conditions of our society. Again, in my own circles, in my own, in what I see in social media, a lot of people are sharing, oh, this is my Google Drive filled with 50 books about Marcos regime, and this is the real history that this is the correct, accurate history, peer reviewed, academically reviewed historical accounts of the Marcos dictatorship. I also have 50 documentaries here in my Google Drive, and so on and so on. But how would you convince people, uh, to view that? Because that presupposes that everyone has the phone or the gadget to be able to, or the internet even, to do that, and not just those material things, but also time, right? Merong material conditions na baka kaya walang access yung ibang tao sa ganun, dahil kumakayod sila sa pagtatrabaho. What? 20 hours a day and so on. And again, I'm not saying it's a moral justification. It is an ontological justification. It explains why things are the way they are. Right? So it might be more convenient to, have those quick snippets of TikTok videos, have those quick YouTube videos, have those quick um, you know um, social media posts and threads and shares, etc. Okay, so it might be convenient. Well, Kant uses convenience in the negative sense, but in our case, some people find it convenient precisely because of the material conditions of our society. No, na hindi naman lahat ng tao merong mabilis na internet para makapag-download o makapag-stream ng mga documentaries. Hindi naman lahat ng tao literate, or hindi naman lahat ng tao merong sapat na oras para magbasa ng mga libro. Many of us are lucky to be in that kind of position, but not everyone are within that material conditions. Okay? So Kant continues, the guardians who have kindly taken upon themselves the work of supervision will soon see to it that by far the largest part of mankind, including the entire fair sex, should consider the step forward to maturity not as difficult, not only as difficult, but also as highly dangerous. Sooner or later, what Kant is telling us here is that ang ipapakita sa atin is that it would be extremely dangerous to think for our own selves. And how does that manifest today? Right? Today, even if there is a law against, against the conflating of protests with terrorism, people are just, red tagging everywhere, red tagging everyone. Kaya nga nakakabahala yung pagiging appointment ni, who was this, ni Boying Remulla as, if I'm not mistaken, DOJ secretary, because that's a known, he's a known red tagger, right? And people think that just because we're critical, people think that just because we protest, that it is a sign of chaos. It is a sign of terrorism. So they're effectively showing us that the moment you think differently from the way we think, from the way we want you to think, from the moment na kumawala ka, na tumiwalag ka sa aming paradigm ng rationality, you will be on a dangerous path. Right? I hope you get what I mean. The argument here is simple. That's the reason why people think that the moment you become critical as UP students, terorista ka siguro. Ganun na agad ang bansag. Because they want you to think that it is dangerous to think differently. It is not just dangerous to think for your own, but it's dangerous to think differently. They want you to just absorb the narrative. Okay? Having first, Kant continues, infatuated their domesticated animals and carefully prevented the docile creatures from daring to take a single step without the leading strings to which they are attached, they next show them the danger which threatens them if they try to walk unaided. Irish has a question here. Does this mean it would be difficult to achieve the enlightened era? Or are we even going to meet the Enlightenment era? This is a good question, Irish, because that's the sort of problem that Kant poses towards the end, you know, uh, because enlightenment rests on a certain promise. And this entire essay, if you read it, this is a very short essay and it's a very easy read. Um, this entire essay is premised on the idea that we are not yet in an enlightened age. But Kant is hopeful. He said, yes, we are not in an enlightened age, but we are in the age of enlightenment. Because when you say enlightened age, you are already in a certain state of actuality. Na-achieve mo na. As opposed to age of enlightenment, it connotes a process. It connotes potentiality. Okay? So for Kant, there, if we want to achieve that actualized state of enlightenment, which is the enlightened age, we have to get rid of the conditions that make us unfree. So what is enlightenment? It is the capacity to think for our own selves without the guidance, without the influence, without the control of the church or of the state. Okay. I'll show you that bit later, Irish. But thank you for bringing that up. That was a brilliant question. So going back to my earlier point, uh, the guardians, again, the state and the church will tell us that it's dangerous to walk alone. It's dangerous to walk using our own feet. No, kailangan merong strings to which we are tied. And the guardians are threatening us that if we dare to walk without those things, it would be dangerous for us. And again, you see this in all kinds of things, right? Some religions do this. The moment na tumiwalag ka, you are going to be ostracized. Christianity did this. The moment you don't subscribe to what Christianity thinks is the correct way of understanding the order of celestial bodies, you are a heretic. So this is not just unique to the Philippine situation. There's a unique history of people doing this, that they only want one form of rationality to prevail, and that is theirs. They don't want you to think differently. So what is the lesson for Kant? Think for your own first. Try to think differently. Because according to Kant, well, we can learn to walk eventually after a few falls. But at least we learn to walk on our own. Parang pagbibisikleta, right? Kung beginner ka sa pagbabike, you will have to have training wheels, but at some point you would have to remove that. No? Andrew has a question here. Sir, I got this question from one of my former classes. How can we expect to produce good people under bad governance? I think this also resonates with our discussion, since whoever has control over discourse, in this case, the truth, holds power. Yeah, this is an excellent problem. Diba? How can we establish goodness in a state of bad things? Um, Again, because I'm going to talk to you about Adorno next meeting, in one of his more literary, well, not literary, but still literary philosophical text titled Minima Moralia. Adorno opens the second part of his Minima Moralia with an aphorism from the British philosopher F.H. Bradley, who said, where everything is bad, it must be good to know the worst. And I think that's the first condition, Andrew, that we need to have. Right? We need to know. We need to have that red ink. We need to have that language to articulate the bad situations that we are in. So the reason why I think the elections failed, because a lot of people are still just content with saying, well, napakabobo naman itong mga hindi bumoto sa kandidatong binoto ko. But it's not as simple as that. It's not just, it's not that they just don't share your opinions and so on. It's much deeper than that. And that's what we lack. So to answer the question, how do we produce good governance in bad conditions? then we have to know that there are bad conditions in the first place. Because that's the thing, not every one of us are aware of this. Not every one of us is aware of the conditions that we are in. Many of us think that this is just a matter of, you know, class divide, which is okay. It's true to a certain extent. Some people think that they're just, you know, they just have the privilege of education and others are just dumb people. Kaya nga, there's also this wonderful article that, you know, what we should learn is that we have to stop this culture of you know, bobotante. I hope, I don't know if you're familiar with that term, the portmanteau of bobo and botante, which some people tend to use quite a lot, right? Because it alienates the others. No, um, so that's my answer, Andrew. If you were to ask me, how do we have, you know, how do we produce good governance in bad situations? We first have to know that there are bad situations, and that's the most difficult thing, I guess. That epistemic capability of understanding, you know, to put it in a in a very vulgar language, to understand the shit that we are in, not just in elections, but in the entire, like in the entire world. Unless we have the red ink to articulate that, unless we have that red ink, we will think everything is just fine. Okay. So I advise you to continue reading this, because this is a very interesting text from Kant, and it speaks a lot to our situation today. But just to be able to show Irish the answer to her question, um, which Kant speaks of here. Here it is, Irish. If it is now asked whether we at present live in an enlightened age, the answer is no. But we do live in an age of enlightenment. As things are at present, we still have a long way to go before men as a whole can be in a position of using their own understanding confidently. And again, in very general terms, this makes sense to us because Kant is speaking here about religious contexts. But we still have a long way to go in order for us to be able to use our own understanding, because we don't even know the consequences. Not We don't have a collective understanding of the consequences of that framing that Andrew speaks of, that mind conditioning, right? Of conditioning us to think in certain ways. Okay. So I'll stop here for now. We have a minute left. Does anyone have any thoughts or maybe questions? Um, I know it's a bit cut short, but definitely will pick up on this again next Thursday, because Adorno uses this as a point of departure. So if you have the time to browse through the text, that would be great. So do you have any questions at this point? Any thoughts? Any concerns? Okay. So if there's none, then you're dismissed. And thank you for being here. See you again on Thursday when we talk about Adorno. So it's the Google Classroom is updated anyway, so you will see the materials there, right? Okay, see you on Thursday. Bye.